Helicopters. How do they work? Well, let's take a look at how to fly helicopters in War Thunder. So first up, this video is only going to cover flying a helicopter in War Thunder. Operating the weapon system will be covered in another video, since that's an equally complicated topic. Also, all of this is going to be oversimplified a little bit, because we're talking about a video game. So I'm only going to cover the basics. Stuff like effective transitional lift, phase lag, no-tar, and the minutia of how a swash plate works with a teetering rotor setup and auto-rotation don't really apply to flying in War Thunder, so I'm not going to spend time on that stuff here. The first thing to understand about flying a helicopter in War Thunder is really how a helicopter flies, the terminology, and some of the limitations. The shortest explanation is that the rotor blades on top of the helicopter, the rotor disc, spins and produces lift the same way that a regular aircraft's wing does, without requiring the vehicle itself to be moving forward, since the spinning blades are themselves in motion. It's like if a plane could get air going over the wings while it was holding still. Movement on the vertical axis is changed with a control stick called the collective. In a helicopter cockpit, this is generally a lever on the left side of the pilot's seat. What this actually does is control the pitch of the rotor blades using some pretty ingenious three-dimensional engineering. When the pitch increases, the rotors generate more lift and the helicopter goes up. The pitch of all of the rotors changes collectively, hence the name collective. The pitch and roll of a helicopter, not the rotor blades, are changed with a control stick called the Cyclic. This is the traditional right-hand flight stick like you'd find in a regular airplane's cockpit. How the Cyclic works is to change the pitch angle of the rotor blades on only one side, increasing the lift on one side or the other, which can tilt the helicopter in the opposite direction. A couple of helicopters, like the Huey family, use a teetering rotor setup which functions slightly differently, but the controls in effect are the same, so the minutiae is not important for now. I'm just mentioning it so that you don't wonder why it looks like the Huey's rotor disc moves a little differently from other helicopters. The pitch changes cyclically as the rotor spins, hence the name cyclic control. The yaw movement, or heading, is controlled with the foot pedals, which adjust the helicopter's tail rotor pitch. This acts against the rotational torque of the main engine to control what direction, left or right, the helicopter's nose is facing. Coaxial helicopters, like the KA-29, use gearbox inputs to create dissymmetry of torque, which allows yaw movement by increasing the torque on one rotor disc or the other, and rotating the helicopter in the corresponding direction. In War Thunder, your helicopter's throttle is generally always set to maximum unless you turn your engine off, and don't do that. All movement controls are done with the collective, cyclic, and pedals. So we talked about different ways of changing attitude and what direction the helicopter is facing. But how do we actually fly in different directions? Well, we need to produce some horizontal lift. By tilting the helicopter forwards, we can split some of the lifting force off the rotor disc and gain some forward momentum. The same thing can apply if we tilt the helicopter to the side or backwards, and simply by using the cyclic to control our tilt attitude, we can move the helicopter in all four directions, forwards, backwards, or either side. Some helicopters can also gain a little forward thrust from their turbine exhaust, but that's not really a big factor in War Thunder. There are also two control modes for flight, regular and hover mode. We're going to start off with regular mode and talk about hover mode afterwards. Let's look at an example of flight and discuss how to read the user interface, as well as how the control inputs are going to get results. We'll discuss keybinds afterwards. Okay, so over on the left-hand side of the user interface, we have a few basic indicators. The RPM is our engine RPM. Again, War Thunder is basically going to manage your throttle for you in a helicopter. The COLL is our collective indicator. Speed, of course, is speed. Then we have some ammo stuff and some engine stats. Over in the center, we have our little artificial horizon and heading indicator. We're going to be talking about that more in a minute. And on the right-hand side is our vertical speed indicator, which is incredibly important in a helicopter. So the first thing I'm going to do is take off by increasing my collective. And you're going to see my COLL on the left went up. As I changed my collective, it'll go up and down. And over on the right-hand side, my vertical speed indicator is showing that I'm gaining right now about 7 meters per second, now about 8 meters per second in altitude. If I decrease my collective, you're going to see that start to drop, and it'll show that I'm losing altitude, and it'll show how fast. So that's extremely important when you're doing forward flight, sideways flight, and so on, in order to manage your altitude as you're moving around. Now you're going to notice that indicator in the center, the artificial horizon, now has an arrow coming out of the top of it. That arrow is going to show me roughly my direction of travel. So if I use my Cyclic to pitch up a little bit, you're going to see the arrow changes and it's not as long. That shows that I'm flying slower. My relative speed in that direction of travel is slowing down. And if I rotate my helicopter, the direction of that arrow changes, showing, my direction of travel hasn't changed, even though the heading of the helicopter, the direction I'm facing, does change. And same thing if I just spin my tail rotor without using any other inputs, it'll spin that right around. So if I want to go from point A to point B and start flying around, first thing we're going to do, there's a little town over there. We're going to fly over to it. I'm going to use my collective to drop down a little bit, so I'm a little bit closer to treetop level, and I'm going to gain some directional lift by pitching over forward. This is going to create some momentum, as some of the lift off of my rotor disc is going to be in the forward direction instead of just the vertical direction. Now you're going to notice my vertical speed indicator went nuts. It went down real quick. I'm going to account for that with the collective and by carefully managing the pitch of my helicopter. The idea being that I'm going to roughly maintain my altitude above the ground, within reason. It's not exact, while maintaining my forward direction. That's generally called nap of the earth flying. So we're going to be flying like right along the terrain contours. I'm not going to get too low down into the trees. I don't want to risk a rotor strike, because we all know that trees in War Thunder are overpowered. But here I'm using my collective combined with inputs on the Cyclic, maintaining my pitch in order to maintain my direction of travel, my speed, and my altitude. So here we've reached this little town. Now you're going to notice something. If I just use my Cyclic and level off, I still have some forward momentum. That's okay. And I'm also just going to start vertically going up, because I've transitioned all of the lift off of my rotor disc into vertical lift. And the only forward momentum I have is generally the momentum that's left over from when I was flying in. And a small amount of thrust off of the turbine exhaust, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if War Thunder even models that. So, flying back to the airfield, we're just going to turn to face it using a combination of tail rotor and cyclic input. And we're going to pitch over forward to get some lift going in the horizontal direction, and I'm going to increase my collective when I do that, so that I'm not going to lose as much altitude as I'm flying forward. Because if you remember, increasing my collective is going to increase the pitch of my rotor blades and generate more lift off of the rotor disc. Well, when I'm flying forward, or if I want to stop for a second, cancel out my forward momentum a little bit. If I'm flying sideways, you can do this too. You can just fly straight sideways. If I'm flying sideways, some of the lift being generated by my rotor disc is being applied to the horizontal movement. Not all of it's going vertical. That's why I'm losing altitude, because my rotor disc is generating the same amount of lift, but not all of it is going vertical. Some of it's being siphoned off for horizontal movement. So you saw there, if I level off, without even changing my collective, all of the rotor's lift transitions from some horizontal back to fully vertical. My horizontal speed will slow down, but my vertical speed will increase. So in order to get moving in normal flight, I'm just going to be pitched forward a little bit and using a combination of small inputs on the cyclic to manage my pitch and using inputs on the collective to manage the pitch of my rotor blades to kind of try and balance out vertical speed versus altitude as I'm flying forward. And I'm not really optimizing this for speed. I'm just kind of trying to optimize for stable flight and altitude above the ground. Now, if we want to do some more advanced techniques, we can add the tail rotor, into our flight controls so that we can swing the helicopter around extremely quickly without sacrificing a whole lot of our horizontal movement. For example, if I want to keep my heading and face around on that, I can swing the tail rotor around, and you notice I'm still flying backwards pretty good, even though we change directions, because it's going to take a minute for the horizontal component of lift coming off of my rotor disc to kick in and cancel out that momentum I had. Now, if I were to try that same maneuver, I'll try it over on that other water tower over there, using only the cyclic without the tail rotor, it's going to look a lot different. So we're flying forward, and after I pass that little tower, I'm just going to turn to face it using only my cyclic. It takes a lot longer to swing the helicopter around, using only the regular mouse inputs for the cyclic. Whereas if I do the same thing again and use the tail rotor when I turn in, generally a coordinated turn, it swings around very quickly, and we're facing the opposite direction before we've even come close to canceling out all of our horizontal momentum. So that is the basics of how to read the user interface for the helicopter flight and using our control inputs to get controlled flight in basically every direction while we're flying a helicopter. So now let's take a look at some keybinds. Okay, the first keybind we want to set is our collective pitch. I have mine set to left shift and the X key with relative control on. This makes it so that I don't have to hold down the key to maintain my collective. Next is pitch and roll, which each have their own axis. Both the pitch and roll axis are controlling the cyclic. For pitch, I have mine set for W to pitch forward and S to pitch backwards, and no relative control. Next is our roll axis. I'm using D and A with no relative control. The yaw axis controls our tail rotor, which I have set to E and Q, again with no relative control. Now for hover mode, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, there are some additional keybinds. I use H to toggle hover mode, go figure, along with the left shift and X with no relative control to adjust my hover height. These are the same keybinds I use for my collective in normal flight, since Well, since in hover mode, they're still controlling the collective, just a little differently. You'll also want to verify your keybind for toggle engine, mostly so that you don't hit it by accident, as well as your landing gear, since some helicopters can pull their gear up. That's about it for basic keybinds. Now let's take a look at hover mode. So if we switch hover mode on, I'm going to hit my H key. You're going to see down in the bottom left it says hover on. Now from there, you're going to see I've got my collective on the user interface changes to hover. Now I've got it set to 100% here because I'm holding my left shift down and I'm gaining altitude at 3 meters per second. If I let go of all keys, my hover says 0% and I'm pretty much maintaining altitude. This is what hover mode does. It lets you sit here and maintain your hover without any key inputs of any kind. You'll just sit here maintaining this hover indefinitely, which when you get into combat situations, obviously has some applications there if you've got a good hidey spot and you don't have to worry about doing manual collective inputs every 5 seconds to try and maintain your altitude. Now, when you're in hover mode, your traditional inputs for your cyclic are very limited. Here I'm giving full deflection left roll on my cyclic, and you're going to see it's barely moving me at all. Now I'm going to give full deflection forward cyclic, barely moving me at all. Same thing with full deflection rear cyclic, full deflection right cyclic. Almost no movement compared to when we're in regular flight mode. You can use your cyclic controls while you're in hover mode to get very small adjustments to your position. If you want to slowly dodge in and out of cover, hiding behind something, or if you just need to reposition very slightly. Your tail rotor, on the other hand, functions pretty much completely normally while you're in hover mode. Everything's essentially going to be the same there. You're just going to spin around and do your tail rotor stuff while you're in hover mode. Now, something that's important to mention, when you switch out of hover mode, you're going to be in a control input situation. You're going to notice my collective's at 77% right now, right? It's going to essentially switch me into a set of inputs, a collective setting that's going to be close to maintaining the hover that we were in. But it'll release the autopilot because, you're going to notice I gained a little bit of directional momentum visible with the arrow coming off of the artificial horizon in the center of our display. Now, if I go back into hover mode, I'm going to slowly lose that directional momentum as the autopilot does its thing. Now, I'm going to go up. I'm going to increase my collective and gain a little bit of altitude there. Let's go up to 120 meters. You're going to see on my vertical speed indicator, it also shows my altitude there. Now I'm at just about 120 meters. Now if I hit H to take hover mode off, I've got my collective at 77 again. That's going to show my collective input being 77 is roughly going to maintain a hover with this helicopter, at this altitude above sea level and all that. So if I were to increase my collective quite a bit, which I just did there, so we're gaining altitude, I'm going to hit H and go right into a hover. And so my collective indicator switches to a hover indicator. Now I'm going to exit hover mode. You're going to see my collective is, again, 77, 78%. So it automatically adjusts it, even though I was at 100% collective before I went into the hover mode. So that's the basics of what's going on with the hover mode there. It's essentially pretty useful, mostly for landing and for combat. Now, I'm going to show you something that ends up being pretty important. I'm going to gain a little bit of forward speed here. Let's see if we can get up to about 200 kilometers an hour. All right, so we're a little over 200 kilometers an hour. In helicopter terms, we're kind of booking it here. Without any other inputs, if I just hit H, it's going to dramatically, you're going to notice it gave some pretty strong cyclic input there to pitch backwards, because it's trying to bleed off my forward momentum. The autopilot's going to kick in and try to maintain my position laterally, left, right, forward, backward. And in order to try and do that, it's going to have to pitch backwards quite a bit to try and cancel out that forward momentum I had. It's not going to move me backwards to be flying to the point where I was at when I hit the hover mode. It's just going to try and cancel out my momentum, and then after it has, it'll sit there. So sometimes if you're flying along pretty quickly, and you need to stop very fast, or if you're in some like weird attitude situation and you're losing control of your helicopter, just hitting H real quick and letting the autopilot try to pull you into a stable hover can be a really safe way to save your butt and prevent a crash. So that's basically what hover mode is all about. So now we're going to talk about a very important concept with helicopters, especially single rotor helicopters, called dissymmetry of lift. Now, in a single rotor helicopter, as we're flying along forward here, just like we're doing, just some controlled flight, our rotor disc is still spinning. Our rotor blades are spinning around the center, around the mast. So one of the rotor blades is going to be kind of moving forward. One of them is going to be kind of moving backward. So if our rotor disc is spinning, for example, counterclockwise, the rotor blade on the right-hand side of the helicopter is going to be moving forward relative to our direction of travel. That's called the advancing blade. And the rotor blade on the left is going to be traveling backwards relative to our direction of travel, which is called the retreating blade. Now, as you're flying forward, your advancing blade is generating slightly more lift than your retreating blade. Normally, and especially in a game like War Thunder here, where it's got, a level of autopilot and control smoothing, it's going to accommodate for that, and you don't have to do any inputs to really account for it. But this is very important for single rotor helicopters because it puts kind of a maximum speed limit aerodynamically. Because if you're traveling forward going too quickly, your right-hand side rotor blade, presuming a counterclockwise rotation, is going to be traveling forward faster, faster enough. There's going to be enough of a differential between how fast your advancing blade is going versus your retreating blade, that you're going to have more lift on one side of the helicopter than the other, and it'll start to roll the helicopter. And you'll lose control and you'll crash if you're not careful. So that's a major factor that impacts, the maximum aerodynamic forward speed that you can achieve in a helicopter. You're going to find in War Thunder, the vast majority of helicopters are never going to exceed about 250 kilometers an hour under normal flight conditions. And the dissymmetry of lift on the rotor blades is one of the primary reasons why. The game accounts for that, and it's going to automatically give you a little bit of roll in the appropriate direction to smooth those inputs out. But in real life, that's a massive limiting factor for single rotor helicopters. So now we're going to take a look at coaxial rotor helicopters. This design eliminates the need for a tail rotor by having two rotor discs on top of each other that spin in opposite directions to counteract the torque of one disc over the other. Coaxial helicopters use some really astounding engineering in the gearbox and the rotor mast that may in fact be witchcraft, but most of the principles are the same as flying a single rotor helicopter. You use the collective to move up and down, and the cyclic for sideways movement by adjusting the pitch of the helicopter. The main difference is that because the helicopter lacks a tail rotor, yaw is controlled through a concept called dissymmetry of torque, where some black magic happens in the gearbox to increase the torque of one rotor disc versus the other, allowing the helicopter to rotate in the appropriate direction entirely off of engine torque. Additionally, dissymmetry of lift in forward flight isn't as much of a speed limit for coaxial rotor designs. Since the rotor discs are spinning in opposite directions, the asymmetric lift from one is cancelled out by the asymmetric lift from the other, and it won't cause the helicopter to roll over sideways. However, coaxial rotor discs cause significantly more old-school aerodynamic drag than single rotor designs, so there's that. So, that was a lot of information, and this was a long video. But flying helicopters competently is pretty complicated, even in a game like War Thunder that autopilots some of the work for you. I hope that this helped improve your helicopter skills, and stay tuned for a tutorial on operating helicopter weapons in War Thunder. As always, thanks for watching.